So let's see some of the examples of the differentiation which we discussed in the previous section. Now in this following two-dimensional graph, this is actually a bubble chart where in the x-axis you have the power index and on the y-axis you have the FIFA index. So all the countries are placed within the power index and the FIFA index, and also the size of the bubble represent the population, and the color also represent which continent they belong to. The positioning is giving the basic two information for one particular country, like the power index in the x-axis and the FIFA index in the y-axis, and the size of the bubble is telling you the population, and the color also telling you the countries. So you can see these three differentiating parameters playing its role. Now if we move on to this map, here we are seeing the internet usage of all the countries in 2007. In the left hand side you can see that we have a contrast, and by the use of the contrast as a filler, we are separating the countries who are having more internet user than the countries who are not having. You don't need to actually use too much colors because sometimes it's overkill. So in certain requirement where you want to show a variation among one parameters, it's always better to use a contrast. So this website is very helpful if you want to create a color palette. Now in the previous graph we saw we have contrast palettes of blue and white, and they were around 5 to 6 contrast palettes. For example, if you want to generate more palettes, like maybe 12, then you can enter the number at this text box and press this button to make a palette. It will generate some palettes and you can refine those palettes by changing the HCl value here. So basically I would always prefer to have single color variations like contrast, which you can do as well, because if you provide too many colors to your user, then your user might be confused. Now basically they are generating some of the colors which the human eye can differentiate. You can also find the hexadecimal code for the colors and the RGB code for the color, which can be used in your CSS, or maybe if you are designing a Photoshop, then this can be used. You need to experiment with this to really come up with a nice color palette, but the advantage with this tool is that it will generate the color palette which the user can differentiate very well. Sometimes what happens that we need to fulfill a requirement for a customer who already have a color palette. So if they already have a color palette, then it's better to go with that. Sometimes you can also create a color palette which is having similar color to your customer's logo or font color. This will really impress your customers because they will appreciate the fact that you have done some research and thoughtful thinking to come up with this color palette. Moving on, the other differentiation factor is shape. So here you can see that we have a upward arrow and a downward arrow to show user that the value is increased or the value is decreased. It's very intuitive and very easy to follow, and user can really see the information that overall sales has gone up by just looking at this shape. Now one of the key points which is always remain as a question is which are the differentiating factors which we need to select. There is no exact rule to be very specific, but the rule of the thumb is you need to make your graph or data visualization as simple as possible. Always have this question in mind that why shouldn't I go with some simple visualization? Why should I have to go with a bubble chart? Why cannot I use a bar chart? The more simpler your solution is, the easier it will be for your user to work on, and the more happier they will be. I personally prefer this pattern. I will always prefer position as my first priority in selecting the differentiating parameter. Then I will go with colors, and then I will go with size. and then I will go with contrast, and at the end I will select shape to show the differentiation. Now this is not an exact rule to say, but this is what has worked well for me, and hopefully it will be working well for you as well.